The first time Hannah Whitfield buried a husband in the hard clay of the Montana plains, she swore she would never bury another dream again, but on the morning the bank man nailed the foreclosure notice to her barn door, she watched her crippled son drag himself across the dirt yard on legs that had never once held his weight, and she understood that some promises are made to be broken by a world that does not care how hard a woman prays. If you believe in kindness, faith, redemption, and second chances, I ask you now, before this story carries you any further, to like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to Walk This Road with me, because what happened next in the town of Miller's Gulch would change the way an entire community looked at mercy, and it began with a man everyone feared and no one understood. The year was 1881, and the wind that came down off the Rockies into the Montana Territory carried with it the smell of dust, sagebrush, and 100 unspoken sorrows. Hannah Whitfield had come west with her husband Thomas 7 years before, full of the kind of hope that only young married folks carry, believing the land promised in the railroad pamphlets would give them a life better than the crowded tenements of St. Louis. They had built a modest homestead at the edge of Miller's Gulch, a small cattle town nestled between brown foothills and a winding creek, and for 2 years the Whitfields had known something close to happiness. Then their son Samuel was born, and the midwife's face had told Hannah everything before the woman ever spoke a word. The boy's legs came into the world twisted beneath him, unable to bear weight, and though his mind was sharp as any child's and his laughter as bright as morning sun on water, the doctors in the territory had little comfort to offer beyond quiet pity. Thomas Whitfield had loved his son fiercely despite the hardship, carrying him on his shoulders through the fields, teaching him to whittle and to read by lamplight, promising the boy that one day they would find a way to help him walk. But 3 years passed. Thomas had ridden out during a spring storm to bring in stray cattle and never returned, his horse found wandering without him near a ravine swollen with snowmelt. They never recovered his body. Hannah had wept until she believed her heart had turned entirely to stone, and then she had risen the next morning, because a woman with a disabled child does not have the luxury of grief that lingers. She had worked the small farm alone since, milking what few cows remained, mending fences with her own blistered hands, and carrying Samuel to church each Sunday in a wagon because his legs would not carry him there himself. By the time Samuel turned 9, the debts had piled higher than the fences Hannah could mend. The bank in town, run by a hard-eyed man named Mr. Ezra Caldwell, had extended credit against the farm when Thomas died, and now Caldwell wanted his due. Hannah had gone to him 3 times begging for patience, offering to work off the debt in any honest way she could find, but Caldwell was a man who measured mercy in dollars and found none to spare. It was on a gray Tuesday morning, with frost still silvering the grass, that his hired man rode out and hammered the foreclosure notice into the barn door, declaring that the Whitfield homestead would be sold at auction within 30 days unless the debt was paid in full. Hannah stood in the yard with her hands trembling, not from the cold but from a fear so deep it had roots in her bones. She looked toward the house where Samuel sat in the doorway, watching with the quiet understanding of a child who has learned too early that the world is not always kind. She did not know, on that morning, that the answer to her prayers was already riding toward Miller's Gulch on a lean gray horse, a man whose name alone was enough to empty a saloon of its loudest voices. His name was Jedediah Cross, though most folks in the territory simply called him Cross, and spoke it the way one speaks of a storm that has passed through and left ruin in its wake. Cross had ridden with a rough outfit in his younger years, men who had taken more from the world than they ever gave back, and though he had long since left that life behind, the stories that followed him were the kind that grow taller with every telling around a campfire. Some said he had killed a man in Abilene over a card game. Others swore he had ridden with outlaws who robbed a stagecoach near the Wyoming line. The truth, known only to Cross himself and to the God he had stopped speaking to somewhere along the way, was both worse and better than the rumors, and it was a truth he carried like a stone in his chest every mile he rode. Cross had come to Miller's Gulch not seeking trouble but seeking distance, the way a man seeks distance from his own reflection. He took a room above the saloon and kept to himself, working odd jobs at the livery stable for a few coins, speaking only when spoken to, and even then saying little. The townsfolk gave him a wide berth, the mothers pulling their children closer when he passed, the men at the saloon falling quiet when his boots crossed the threshold. It was a lonely existence, and Cross had long ago decided that loneliness was simply the price a man paid for the things he had done, a debt with no foreclosure date because it could never truly be settled. It was outside the general store, on the very day the notice was nailed to Hannah's barn, that Cross first laid eyes on Samuel Whitfield. The boy had been brought to town by a neighbor's wagon while his mother sought yet another audience with Caldwell at the bank, and he sat on the wooden boardwalk with his legs folded beneath him, sketching the mountains in the dirt with a stick because paper was a luxury the family could not afford. Cross had stopped, drawn by something he could not name, and watched the boy work with a concentration that reminded him, unwelcome and sudden, of a brother he had lost long ago in a war that had taken more from this country than anyone cared to count. When Samuel looked up and offered him an unguarded smile, unafraid despite every rumor he surely had heard, Cross felt something crack open in his chest that he had kept sealed shut for 15 years. He asked the boy his name, and Samuel told him plainly, then asked in return why a man so many called dangerous looked so sad standing in the sunlight. Cross had no answer for that, not one he could speak aloud, but he crouched down beside the boy and asked to see his drawing, and for a few minutes, the fiercest and most feared man in the territory sat in the dust with a crippled child, discussing the shape of the mountains as if nothing in the world mattered more. When Hannah returned from her failed meeting with Caldwell, her eyes red from swallowed tears, she found Cross kneeling beside her son and felt her heart seize with fear, for she too had heard the stories. Cross rose slowly, removed his hat in a gesture of respect that surprised her more than his presence had frightened her, and said only that her boy had a fine eye for drawing and a finer heart than most grown men he had met. Hannah did not know what to make of this stranger, but something in his weathered face, some sorrow that mirrored her own, made her hesitate before hurrying Samuel away as instinct urged her to do. Word of the debt spread through Miller's Gulch as such things always do, carried on the tongues of shopkeepers and churchwomen, and most folks shook their heads with pity but did nothing more, for they had their own struggles and their own fields to tend. But Cross could not shake the image of that boy in the dirt, drawing mountains he would likely never climb, or the memory of Hannah's exhausted eyes. He rode out to the Whitfield homestead 3 days later, uninvited and unannounced, and found Hannah repairing a fence alone, her hands raw and bleeding from the wire. She was startled and wary when she saw him approach, clutching the hammer in her hand as though it might offer protection, but Cross dismounted a respectful distance away and spoke plainly, telling her he had heard of her trouble with the bank and asking if she would allow him to help with the fence, and perhaps, in time, with other burdens too heavy for one woman to carry alone. Hannah's pride rose up first, as it often does in those who have learned that kindness sometimes comes with hidden costs, and she told him she did not need charity from a stranger, least of all one with his reputation. Cross had simply nodded, understanding her fear better than she knew, and said that he was not offering charity but honest work for honest work, that he would mend her fences and tend her cattle in exchange for nothing but a meal at her table, and that she could send him away the moment she felt unsafe. It was Samuel who finally tipped the scales, calling out from the doorway that he remembered the man who had admired his mountain drawing, and asking his mother to let him stay. Hannah looked between her son's hopeful face and the quiet patience in Cross's eyes, and something in her exhausted heart relented. She allowed him to stay that afternoon, and then the next, and slowly, over the weeks that followed, Jedediah Cross became a fixture at the Whitfield homestead, repairing what years of hardship had broken, both in the fences and, though it took far longer, in the hearts of the mother and son who lived there. Cross taught Samuel to fish from the creek bank, rigging a sling so the boy could cast his line without needing to stand, and he built him a small wheeled cart from scrap lumber and old wagon wheels so Samuel could move about the farm on his own for the first time in his life, propelling himself with strong young arms that had grown powerful from years of dragging his body across hard ground. He carved the boy a set of toy horses from pine wood in the evenings by lamplight, the same way, Hannah realized with an ache in her chest, that Thomas once had. And though Cross never spoke of his past, never explained the darkness that clung to his name throughout the territory, Hannah began to see in him not the outlaw the town feared but a man desperately trying to outrun something, seeking in this broken little family some measure of the redemption he did not believe himself to deserve. But peace in the Old West was never a thing that lasted without challenge, and Ezra Caldwell was not a man who took kindly to obstacles in the path of his prophet. When word reached him that the notorious Cross had taken up residence, in effect, at the Whitfield homestead, and that the fences were mended and the cattle tended with a vigor the widow alone could never have managed, Caldwell grew uneasy, for a solvent farm could not be so easily seized. He rode out himself with 2 hired men, ostensibly to inspect the property ahead of the coming auction, but truly to intimidate the widow into abandoning her hope of saving her land. He found Cross in the yard instead, sleeves rolled, hammering a new post into the earth, and the sight of him stopped Caldwell's threats in his throat, for even a man who dealt in fear his whole life recognized a fear greater than his own reflected in the set of Cross's jaw. Caldwell blustered nonetheless, reminding all present that the law was on his side and that 30 days remained before the widow's home would be sold to the highest bidder, debt or no debt, kindness or no kindness. Cross said nothing in response, only looked at the banker with an unreadable calm that unsettled the man far more than shouted threats could have, and Caldwell rode away that day promising himself he would see the matter resolved on schedule, one way or another. That night, sitting by the fire after Samuel had been carried to bed, Hannah finally asked Cross the question that had lived unspoken between them for weeks: why a man with his reputation, a man the whole territory seemed to fear, would spend his days mending fences for a widow who could offer him nothing but supper and gratitude. Cross was quiet for a long while, staring into the flames as though searching for words buried deep beneath years of silence, and then he told her, haltingly, of the war he had fought as a young man, and of the brother he had lost in it, a brother who had dreamed of becoming a doctor and helping crippled children just like Samuel. He told her of the years after, when grief had turned to anger and anger had led him into the company of men who took what they wanted at the point of a gun, and of the day he had finally walked away from that life after a robbery had gone wrong and an innocent man had died before his eyes, a death Cross had never forgiven himself for allowing. He told her that every kindness he offered her son felt like a small repayment on a debt he knew could never truly be settled, and that in Samuel's laughter he heard, for the first time in 15 years, something that sounded almost like forgiveness. Hannah wept quietly as he spoke, not from fear but from the recognition of a grief that mirrored her own, and when she reached out and took his rough, scarred hand in hers, it was the first time in 3 years that either of them had allowed themselves to be comforted by another living soul. The 30 days dwindled toward their end, and though Cross worked tirelessly, there was no honest way to raise the sum Caldwell demanded in so short a time, not through fences mended or cattle tended. It was Samuel, in his childlike wisdom, who suggested the solution that grown minds had overlooked, remembering that Cross still possessed the fine gray horse he had ridden into town, an animal of clear breeding and considerable value, along with a saddle worked in silver that spoke of a life Cross had left behind but never quite discarded. Cross had resisted at first, for that horse and saddle were among the last possessions tying him to his old life, a life he was trying desperately to bury. But looking at Samuel's hopeful face and Hannah's quiet desperation, he understood that some things were worth surrendering entirely, and that true redemption often demanded the sacrifice of exactly what a man was most reluctant to give. He rode to the neighboring town of Bozeman and sold both horse and saddle to a cattle baron who had long admired the animal, returning 3 days later on a borrowed mule with enough money to satisfy a portion of the debt, though not the whole of it. What remained, the whole of Miller's Gulch supplied without being asked, for word had spread of the feared outlaw who had given up his prized horse for a crippled boy and his widowed mother, and something in that act had cracked open the hardened hearts of a town that had, until then, offered only pity from a safe distance. The preacher took up a collection after Sunday service. The blacksmith forgave a debt Thomas had left unpaid years before. Even the shopkeepers who had once crossed the street to avoid Cross's shadow now pressed coins into his hand, asking him to see that the widow and her son were provided for. When the day of reckoning came, Ezra Caldwell stood on the steps of his bank expecting to announce the seizure of the Whitfield homestead, only to find Cross and half the town assembled before him, the full sum of the debt counted out and placed in his reluctant hands. Caldwell's face flushed with the particular fury of a man who has been outmaneuvered by mercy, but there was nothing left for him to do but accept the payment and watch the deed to the land pass back into Hannah Whitfield's trembling hands. She wept openly on those bank steps, not caring who witnessed her tears, and when she turned to Cross to offer her gratitude, she found the fearsome outlaw of Miller's Gulch weeping quietly himself, for the first time since the brother of his youth had been laid in the ground. In the months that followed, Cross did not leave the Whitfield homestead as many had expected he would, once his usefulness was spent. He stayed, first as a hired hand, and then, as the seasons turned and trust deepened into something neither Hannah nor Cross could any longer deny, as something far more permanent. They were married the following spring in the small clapboard church at Miller's Gulch, with Samuel wheeling himself down the aisle in the cart Cross had built him, beaming with a joy that seemed to light the whole chapel brighter than the sun streaming through its windows. The town that had once feared Cross now welcomed him as one of their own, for they had witnessed with their own eyes the truth that no man is beyond the reach of redemption, that even the hardest heart can be softened by the simple, stubborn love of a child who never learned to be afraid. Before I bring this story to its close, I want to ask you something important. Please leave a comment below and tell me where in the world you are watching this from, and share with me the lesson you carried away from Hannah, Samuel, and Cross's journey through hardship into grace. Your words mean more than you know, and they remind me that stories of faith and redemption still matter in this world. Samuel grew older on that Montana homestead, and though his legs never gained the strength to carry him as other boys' legs did, Cross built him ramps and carts and even, eventually, a specially fitted saddle so the boy could ride beside him across the very same fields his father Thomas had once worked. Samuel never became a rancher himself, but he became something the territory needed just as badly, apprenticing with a traveling doctor and eventually returning to Miller's Gulch to tend the sick and injured of a town that had once looked upon him with pity and came, in time, to look upon him with pride. Hannah lived to see her son build a life of purpose and her husband, the man everyone once feared, become the most trusted rancher and father in the whole territory, a living testament to the truth that kindness, once planted, grows roots deeper than any debt or any darkness. If this story touched your heart even a little, if you believe as I do that mercy can reach even the most feared among us, and that a broken family can be made whole again through faith, courage, and the stubborn kindness of one unlikely soul, then please like this video, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, share it with someone who needs to believe in second chances today, and subscribe for more stories of the Old West where hope always finds a way home. Thank you for riding this trail with me, and until next time, may you carry a little more faith, a little more courage, and a little more kindness into your own corner of this wide and wondrous world.